In his book *Sapiens: A Brief History of Humankind*, I think that they feel that anyway that you've all introduced some unique concepts that provide some interesting challenges to accepted standards, especially regarding some of the areas of political philosophy, some of our social structures, and many religious, economic, and scientific prejudices. Also, this is not a summary of the book. It is rather a summary of some of the ideas that I found most interesting in Yuval's work. Warning: at times, Mini-Me will be digressing to talk about a philosophical issue that was not necessarily a part of Harari's book, but his book was instrumental in surfacing that issue. Yuval starts by building a strong framework for how sapiens evolved. He walks us through a 14 billion year timeline, demonstrating that culture has only been around for 70,000 of those 14 billion years. The advantage of designing the timeline this way is that it places culture on the same plane as the other three. This is very relevant for later discussions. Here is our first mini-me interruption. I don't want to get into a long discussion about dependency models. However, for those interested in it, I have a separate YouTube discussion. I will talk about dependency modeling. But for now, suffice it to say that dependency models are important and common in historical and declarative statements. And it is important to remember that the breadth and shape of the dependency model should demonstrate how many behaviors and principles are inherited. There's a whole relationship that gets set between using something like this image that we see, the upside down pyramid, versus people standing on other people's shoulders or holding things up. And a lot depends upon, the breadth and depth of what you're trying to indicate, and especially of the inheritance with regards to the dependency model. If you look at our example, okay, the chemistry inherits all of the principles of physics, and biology those of chemistry. However, not all chemicals are found in every biological entity. The basic principles for any chemical found in the biological entity, if it's the same, are consistent. And finally, in our model, culture inherits the behaviors and principles of biology, which, as we will see later, creates preferences for different cultural myths. So now let's go back to where we were about the book. Harari then provides a short explanation of how culture even came to be by pointing out that sapiens' large brain necessitated an early birth, which then created a need for a longer socialization period than most other species. This longer socialization was then advantaged by memory. This memory provides sapiens with a means to educate newborns by enabling the information necessary to be passed from one generation to the next using stories and myths. These stories and myths are built from language, and memory also enables sapiens to develop abstract concepts like math, which were instrumental in supporting the myths. The downside is that this ability also enabled this rather weak species to overcome the chains and limitations of the evolutionary timeline. Neither sapiens nor any of the other species on the planet had time to adjust to these newfound talents. So now, this somewhat insignificant species develops culture and frees themselves from the biological restraints. And this is important for multiple reasons. One is that the speed of change can now increase dramatically, as sapiens are not dependent on the slow and inefficient mutation cycle for adaptation. Another issue that surfaces is that this rapid development in sapien status places this biological weak creature at the top of the evolutionary pyramid, and they find themselves fearful, anxious, cruel, and thereby very dangerous. This spells doom for most other species, as sapiens explore the whole planet. Now let us consider what we are talking about when we mention myths. Harari states that anything that doesn't have an objective existence is in all likelihood a myth. This includes gods, human rights, principles like human rights, nations, laws, the idea of justice, and even money. What has happened is that these imaginary realities, these myths, along with sapiens' massive repertoire of tools, now control the destiny of objective reality. One other significant aspect of myths is that they provide support for managing and controlling large groups. Think about the myths of religion, states, and economies that rule over billions of individuals. So let's look at the road of this development. All right, and so let's look at it early on. The backseat driver for Sapiens, as they drove along the road of life, was primarily just the evolutionary forces associated with physics, chemistry, and biology. We could only run a certain speed based on the physical makeup of our bodies. We could only see a certain distance, etc. The forces of nature created limits on us, and we acted within those limits. Our DNA created limitations on our abilities and the preferences for our survival. And it's important that we consider the word preference and not and it's not fixed. I mean, we can act inside of our biology differently, even though the biology prefers that we act a certain way. Okay, but then with the advent of culture, the others take a back seat, right? And so the natural forces become a little less instrumental. We are now starting down a new path where culture provides the direction. As Harari states, biology enables and culture forbids. Now, for me, this is one of the most significant points that he makes for us. As the voice of culture gets stronger and stronger, nature is almost silenced. So the difference in our dependency model is that culture is now unhooking itself from the constraints of the physical, chemical, and biological. It appears to me that the idea that culture is the sole source of normative behavior, or what we ought to do, puts a damper on much of political philosophy, as it implies that trying to find out what our natural proclivities are is not really that relevant anymore. We are off the evolutionary reservation. So now, if we come back to our road here, all right, over time, the Cultural Revolution moves to the Agricultural Revolution, where the voice for growth becomes the loudest voice in the back seat. And this growth in quantity did bring with it reduced quality for both sapiens and also for all of the species that they domesticated. Now, starting around 300 years ago, we see a new voice in the back seat. This one is the voice of science and reasoning. It is thought that this voice of reasoning will improve all aspects of sapiens' behavior. As Nietzsche points out in his philosophy, where he talks about kind of inverting the triangle, because most people, when they talked about the triangle, they always had God at the top. Nietzsche talks about the fact that God really is the point of the triangle, and that the scientific revolution, okay, brought about the basic breakdown of all these myths and pulled God off of this chart. And if you remove the point at the bottom, everything else falls down. So basically, Nietzsche points out that our values, our institutions, everything stood on the concepts prevalent in the myths. And when the myths are gone, then the whole structure falls. So now, I guess one of the questions that we want to look at here also is that the scientific revolution also silenced the agricultural voice. The amount of people who are now working in agriculture and the amount of sapiens involved in agriculture is infinitesimal compared to what it used to be. So let's look at today's 21st century myths, okay? The 21st century myths that have the loudest voice in the back seat include romanticism, capitalism, humanism, nationalism, consumerism, variety, and scientism. And if we take variety as an example, I mean, these things are vying for the mind share, and they're acting as if they're truths, not myths. There's a thought process out there that says that that man is naturally requires variety. When variety, the whole concept of variety, is actually just a 21st century myth. Okay? Meanwhile, the artifacts that stand behind these myths are massive, and they've imprisoned sapiens again using every part of sapiens' tapestry of life. I mean, these myths are wrapped around everything: our education, our architecture, our fairy tales, our paintings, our political propaganda. I mean, everything wraps around and kind of personifies and then exhibits the myths so that it looks to us as if these myths are really natural. Okay? Now, right now, however, there's a trend in Sapiens' intellectual capabilities, and this trend is a result of Sapiens being able to make their imagined realities become objective realities and to build an intelligently designed universe. So, one possible future is that Sapiens is no longer tied to nature at all, and the car is driven by a being that is a merger of biological and intellectual design, and we no longer have they're merged together, and they're no longer they're not a dependency anymore, all right? And this will require a whole new normative approach and new philosophical arguments. However, there's also the question of whether the non-biological components of the merger may not just develop its own species without any Sapiens components. If that were to happen, I suggest that Sapiens develop artifacts that address our wishes with this new species. However, it appears that many contemporary experts are suggesting that Sapiens come up with some safeguards for this new species. I suggest that we not make the Genesis mistake. Let's not, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Stephen Hawking, people have said that we have to figure out a way that we can control artificial intelligence. And when I hear that, I think of how in the book of Genesis, you were allowed to just not eat that one apple, and it's the idea that we can actually manage this being that ultimately has the capability to create its own motivation. It is very similar to us thinking that we can manage a being that came in a spacecraft. It's just an alien being that landed on Earth, and then we decided this is how we're going to manage them. That can't happen. And I actually suggest that the only artifact that we have that actually would work is an artifact in which we basically request that this new species please don't annihilate us. And to me, that's the direction that we have to look at for the future, and we have to look at from a philosophical perspective how we drive things to that point, how we drive everything that we're doing to create a communication with another species, and that politely requests that they don't annihilate us. Thank you.